Some silences are empty, and some silences are actually the loudest form of reverence a particular kind of person is capable of offering. This distinction rarely gets made clearly enough, which is exactly why so many people spend years assuming that an avoidance quiet simply means absence, disinterest, or a slow fade into indifference, when in a specific, rare category of connection, the opposite is closer to the truth. There is a version of silence that isn't the death of love at all. It's love being handled so carefully, so protectively, that it never gets touched by the very hands that might otherwise damage it. What follows isn't a fantasy designed to keep anyone waiting by a phone that isn't going to ring, and it isn't permission to romanticize neglect. It's an explanation of something genuinely specific in avoidant psychology. Why certain connections become treated almost like something sacred, guarded rather than pursued, protected through distance rather than expressed through presence. And why the avoidant capable of this particular kind of reverence often has no idea how to communicate it in any language other than the silence being described here. Anyone listening who has felt, against all logic, that a particular connection with an avoidant carried a different weight than anything either of them had experienced before, something that felt less like an ordinary relationship and more like an accidental collision with something neither person fully understood how to hold, deserves to hear this explained clearly rather than dismissed as wishful thinking. Because what's being described here isn't wishful thinking. It's a recognizable, well-documented pattern in how certain avoidants relate to the rare connections that manage to bypass their usual defenses entirely. It's worth acknowledging too how isolating it can feel to sense this kind of difference in a connection without having language for it, especially when everyone else's advice about avoidant partners tends to assume that all avoidant silence functions the same way, as simple disinterest, requiring the same simple response of walking away and never looking back. That advice isn't wrong in most cases, and it remains genuinely important as a general guide for protecting oneself from prolonged uncertainty. But general guidance, however useful most of the time, doesn't always account for every specific case, and the particular texture of this rarer pattern deserves its own careful explanation, rather than being flattened into the same category as every other, more ordinary version of avoidant withdrawal. To understand why silence and reverence can coexist so completely inside an avoidant, it helps to first understand what most of their relationships actually look like, because the contrast is where this entire explanation becomes visible. For most avoidants, most connections, even ones that last years, remain within a manageable emotional range, comfortable enough to sustain, but never quite intense enough to threaten the underlying architecture of control and distance they've spent a lifetime building. These relationships get handled the way most people handle ordinary, replaceable things, with a kind of casual, unexamined confidence that nothing catastrophic will happen if they're mishandled occasionally. A sacred connection, by contrast, doesn't get handled that way, because it doesn't feel replaceable, and it doesn't feel casual, not even to someone whose entire personality is organized around casualness as a form of self-protection. It feels, instead, like something fragile and enormous simultaneously, something the avoidant senses, often without ever consciously naming it this way, could be permanently damaged by their own usual patterns of carelessness, inconsistency, or emotional unavailability. And this sensing, this quiet, often unconscious recognition that ordinary handling would ruin something extraordinary, is precisely where the silence being discussed throughout this exploration actually originates. This is worth sitting with because it inverts a common assumption people make about avoidant silence, the assumption that silence always signals a lack of investment. In this specific, rarer category of connection, silence often signals almost the opposite, an investment so significant that the avoidant becomes afraid of their own capacity to damage it through the very behaviors that damaged every previous relationship they've ever been part of. There's a particular kind of terror embedded in this dynamic, the terror of finally encountering something worth protecting, and simultaneously not trusting oneself to be capable of protecting it without ruining it in the process. It's worth pausing to name how counterintuitive this actually is, because most explanations of human behavior assume that valuing something leads naturally toward pursuing it more actively, not less. This assumption holds true for most people in most circumstances, which is exactly why avoidant behaviour in this specific context so often confuses partners, friends, and sometimes the avoidants themselves. The usual logic, that greater value produces greater effort, simply doesn't apply cleanly here, because an avoidance relationship with their own capability is fundamentally different from most people's. For someone without a deeply ingrained fear of their own capacity to damage what they touch, greater value would indeed produce greater pursuit. For an avoidant carrying this particular fear, greater value instead produces greater caution, sometimes escalating all the way into complete avoidance, precisely because the stakes of getting it wrong feel unbearably high in a way they never quite do with anything considered replaceable or ordinary. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture someone who has spent their entire life handling ordinary, replaceable objects carelessly, setting cups down without coasters, leaving books open and face down, treating most possessions as things that can always simply be replaced if damaged. Then imagine this same person suddenly finding themselves responsible for something irreplaceable, something ancient and fragile, a piece of art or an heirloom, carrying weight and meaning far beyond its physical form. Their instinct isn't to handle it the same careless way they've always handled everything else. Their instinct is often to barely touch it at all, to keep it at a careful distance, sometimes even to avoid engaging with it directly, precisely because the stakes of mishandling something this significant feel unbearable in a way that mishandling something ordinary never did. This is close to what happens inside an avoidant who has stumbled into a genuinely sacred connection. The very significance of what they've found becomes the reason they handle it with distance, rather than the closeness that significance would seem, on the surface, to demand. It's worth being precise about what actually makes a connection feel sacred to an avoidant, because this word gets used loosely in ordinary conversation, but the psychological reality underneath it is fairly specific and worth naming clearly. A sacred connection, in this context, tends to be one where the avoidant experienced something rare, a version of themselves that felt more honest, more alive, more fully present than they typically allow themselves to be, alongside a version of the other person that felt entirely safe to be honest and alive around, without the usual fear of judgment, engulfment, or eventual abandonment that colours almost every other relationship they've ever had. This combination, feeling both more themselves and more safe simultaneously, is exceedingly rare for an avoidant, precisely because their usual coping strategy involves choosing between authenticity and safety, rather than ever experiencing both at once. Most of their relationships require sacrificing one for the other, either performing a more guarded, controlled version of themselves in order to feel safe, or occasionally allowing genuine vulnerability at the cost of feeling dangerously exposed and unprotected. A sacred connection collapses this usual trade-off entirely, and that collapse is disorienting in a way that's difficult to overstate, because it removes the very framework the avoidant has always relied upon to navigate closeness without becoming overwhelmed by it. For anyone listening who experienced a connection like this, one that felt different from the very beginning in ways that were hard to articulate at the time, there's something important worth validating here. That feeling of difference was very likely accurate. Not every relationship an avoidant enters carries this particular quality, and recognizing that a specific connection did carry it isn't romanticizing something ordinary into something extraordinary. It's naming, with real psychological grounding, a pattern that genuinely does distinguish certain rare connections from everything else in an avoidance relational history. It helps to name with more specificity what actually tends to distinguish this kind of reverent silence from ordinary indifference in observable terms, because vague reassurance about internal psychology can be difficult to trust without something more concrete to examine. Several markers tend to appear consistently in cases where an avoidance silence stems from this particular kind of protective reverence, and understanding them helps clarify whether a specific situation genuinely fits this pattern, or whether it's simply being hoped into fitting it. One marker involves how an avoidant discusses, or notably avoids discussing, the connection when it does come up, even indirectly, in conversation with others. Ordinary past relationships tend to get referenced casually, sometimes with humour, sometimes with mild criticism or dismissiveness, folded easily into general conversation without much visible weight attached. A genuinely sacred connection tends to be handled very differently, either avoided almost entirely, a topic the avoidant seems to steer around rather than engage with directly, or, when it does surface, discussed with a noticeable shift in tone, more careful, more hesitant, occasionally accompanied by a kind of unguarded tenderness that seems almost involuntary, quickly followed by an attempt to redirect the conversation elsewhere before that tenderness becomes too visible or too uncomfortable to sustain. Another marker involves the specific quality of memory an avoidant seems to retain regarding the connection, compared to how they typically remember other past relationships. Most relationships, once ended, tend to blur in an avoidant's memory over time, softened and generalized the way most memories eventually become. A genuinely sacred connection tends to resist this blurring in a way that's fairly noticeable if anyone happens to be paying close enough attention. Specific details remain unusually vivid. Specific moments get referenced with a precision that seems disproportionate to how much time has actually passed, as though the memory has been protected, consciously or not, from the same gradual erosion that governs most of an avoidant's other memories. A further marker, somewhat harder to observe directly, but worth naming nonetheless, involves how an avoidant tends to behave in subsequent relationships that follow a genuinely sacred connection. It's not uncommon for these subsequent relationships to carry a persistent, if unspoken, quality of comparison, an inability to fully invest that seems disconnected from anything actually happening in the new relationship itself. This isn't always visible to outside observers, and it's rarely something the avoidant would openly admit, even if asked directly. But it often manifests as a kind of chronic incompleteness, a sense, both to the avoidant and sometimes to their subsequent partners, that something essential remains withheld, unavailable, protected somewhere the new relationship simply doesn't have access to. It's worth being careful here because these markers, like any pattern applied retroactively to interpret ambiguous behaviour, can easily be misapplied by someone searching hard enough for reassurance that a particular connection fit this rare, significant category. The honest, more difficult truth is that most connections an avoidant has, even ones that mattered genuinely at the time, do not carry this specific quality. Most past relationships simply become, over time, unremarkable history, softened and eventually forgotten in the ordinary way most relationships eventually are. Recognizing the difference between a connection that genuinely carries this rarer quality and one that simply ended painfully, leaving behind ordinary grief rather than this specific protective reverence, requires real honesty rather than wishful interpretation. And that honesty, however disappointing it might feel in the moment, tends to serve long-term healing far better than a comforting story that doesn't actually hold up under closer examination. Now consider what happens once an avoidant recognizes, even unconsciously, that they've encountered exactly this kind of connection. Because recognition doesn't produce the response most people would expect or hope for. It doesn't produce a rush toward closeness, an eager embrace of the safety and authenticity being offered. It very often produces the opposite, an intensified retreat, precisely because the stakes involved in potentially damaging something this significant feel too enormous to risk through their usual, well-practiced patterns of engagement. This retreat gets misread constantly, by partners, by friends offering advice, sometimes even by the avoidant themselves, as evidence of the exact opposite of what's actually happening. It looks like disinterest. It looks like fear of commitment, in the ordinary sense the phrase usually implies. But underneath this retreat, in the specific case of a genuinely sacred connection, there's often something closer to reverent paralysis, a state where the avoidant recognizes the significance of what they've found so acutely that they become unable to act on it in any of the ways their usual relational patterns would normally guide them to act. There's something crucial worth naming here, because it explains why this particular kind of retreat feels so different, even to the person experiencing it, from the avoidant's ordinary patterns of distancing. Ordinary avoidant distancing tends to be accompanied by a kind of relief, a sense of regaining control and space after feeling crowded or demanded upon. The retreat that follows a sacred connection carries almost no relief at all. It's accompanied instead by a persistent, uncomfortable ache, a sense of having walked away from something the avoidant desperately wanted to hold on to, but didn't trust themselves enough to hold without eventually breaking it. This distinction matters enormously for anyone trying to understand whether a particular avoidance silence reflects genuine indifference or this rarer, more complicated form of reverence. Indifference tends to be accompanied by relative ease, a lightness in how the avoidant discusses or thinks about the relationship that ended, minimal evidence of ongoing preoccupation or difficulty moving forward. The silence born from reverence tends to carry a completely different texture, heavier, more persistent, marked by an unmistakable, if rarely expressed, difficulty letting the memory of the connection settle into the same category as everything else that's come before it. It's worth addressing something important here, because this entire explanation could easily be misused to justify staying attached to a silence that offers no actual benefit or forward movement in someone's life. Recognizing that an avoidance silence might stem from reverence rather than indifference does not mean that silence deserves to be waited out indefinitely, and it doesn't mean the connection being described here is automatically worth pursuing or preserving, regardless of what it costs the person left waiting on the other side of it. Sacredness, in an avoidance internal experience, doesn't guarantee any particular outcome. It doesn't guarantee eventual reconciliation, doesn't guarantee the avoidant will ever develop the capacity to act on what they feel, rather than simply protecting it through distance indefinitely, and doesn't obligate anyone to remain in a holding pattern, hoping that reverence eventually translates into presence. This distinction between understanding something and being obligated to wait for it deserves to be held clearly throughout everything that follows. What's being offered here is clarity, not a reason to pause a life in progress. There's a specific reason sacred connections tend to produce this particular pattern of protective silence, rather than any of the more common avoidant responses to closeness. And understanding it requires looking more closely at what the avoidant is actually protecting when they choose distance over engagement. In most avoidant relationships, distance functions as self-protection, a way of shielding themselves from vulnerability, engulfment, or the discomfort of being fully seen. In a genuinely sacred connection, distance often functions differently, less as self-protection and more as protection of the connection itself, an attempt, however misguided and ultimately self-defeating, to preserve something valuable by keeping it untouched, rather than risking its destruction through direct engagement. This distinction, subtle as it sounds, actually explains a great deal of confusing avoidant behaviour that would otherwise seem contradictory. It explains why an avoidant might speak about a specific past connection with unusual tenderness, even years later, while showing no comparable tenderness toward other past relationships that objectively lasted longer or involved more shared history. It explains why certain memories seem to remain untouched by the usual process of retrospective reframing and minimization avoidants typically apply to their romantic history, staying vivid and significant rather than fading into the same vague, unremarkable category everything else eventually settles into. And it explains why silence, in this specific case, so often persists indefinitely, rather than eventually breaking, the way silence following more ordinary avoidant withdrawal often does. There's a metaphor worth holding here as well, because it captures something important about how this kind of protective silence actually functions psychologically. Picture someone standing before a door they believe leads to something extraordinary, something they've wanted their entire life, without ever quite being able to name it clearly. Rather than walking through that door, they find themselves standing frozen just outside it, terrified that opening it will reveal the extraordinary thing was never real to begin with, or worse, that opening it will somehow damage or diminish something that currently exists in their imagination in a state of perfect, untouched possibility. Staying outside the door preserves the fantasy, Walking through it risks confronting a reality that might fall short of what's been imagined, or risks the avoidant's own clumsy handling, ruining something that, left unopened, remains permanently, safely extraordinary. This is close to what sustained, reverent silence often represents for an avoidant facing a genuinely sacred connection. The silence isn't simply avoidance of the other person. It's avoidance of risking the destruction of something that currently exists, in their internal world, in a protected, idealized form. A form that direct engagement, given their own well-documented history of struggling with closeness, might not survive intact. It's worth being honest about the deep irony embedded in this entire pattern, because understanding it clarifies why this particular kind of silence, however well-intentioned in its own confused way, tends to produce outcomes that serve no one well. The very fear that motivates this protective distance, the fear of damaging something precious through direct engagement, guarantees, through the distance itself, that the connection never gets the chance to become anything more than a preserved, static memory. Protecting a connection through permanent absence isn't actually protection at all. It's a slow, quiet form of loss, dressed up in language that makes it feel, to the avoidant experiencing it, like reverence, rather than what it actually is. Another version of the same avoidance that has shaped every other relationship in their life. This is an important truth to hold alongside everything validating about being recognized as someone an avoidant experience this way. Being the object of this kind of reverent, protective silence is genuinely meaningful information about how significant a connection was. It is not, however, evidence that the avoidant is actively working toward becoming capable of engaging with that significance directly, and it's not a promise that this protective silence will eventually transform into presence. Some avoidants remain in this pattern indefinitely, treating a specific connection as a kind of permanently sealed, sacred memory, rather than something they ever attempt to reopen or pursue in reality. For these avoidants, the silence isn't a phase leading toward eventual reconnection. It's simply how they've chosen, consciously or not, to relate to something they consider too significant to risk touching again. For anyone listening who suspects they occupy this specific place in an avoidance internal world, there's an important question worth sitting with honestly, rather than rushing past toward whatever answer feels most comforting. What does it actually mean, practically, for someone's life going forward, to know that a past connection is being held this carefully, this reverently, by someone who nonetheless remains completely silent and completely absent? The honest answer requires resisting two equally tempting but ultimately unhelpful extremes. The first tempting extreme involves dismissing this entire explanation as meaningless, insisting that if an avoidant truly valued the connection, they would act on it, and that silence, regardless of its underlying psychological texture, simply isn't worth taking seriously as evidence of anything. This extreme has some practical wisdom behind it, because it protects against the real risk of waiting indefinitely for someone who may never act differently, regardless of how much internal reverence they might genuinely be carrying. But this extreme also risks discarding something genuinely true, and, in its own way, genuinely valuable. An accurate understanding of what actually happened inside someone during a connection that clearly meant something significant. An understanding that can offer real closure, regardless of whether it ever produces any change in the avoidance behaviour. The second tempting extreme involves the opposite mistake, treating this explanation as sufficient reason to remain indefinitely available, hopeful, or emotionally tethered to someone who has demonstrated, through sustained silence, an unwillingness or inability to act on whatever reverence they might be carrying. This extreme risks trading a present, actual life for an idealized possibility that may never materialize, built on an understanding of someone else's internal experience that, however accurate, was never a guarantee of anything about the future. The healthier path runs directly between these two extremes, holding both truths simultaneously, without collapsing either one into the other. It's entirely possible, and psychologically accurate, to believe that a specific connection was genuinely sacred to an avoidant, that their silence reflects reverence rather than indifference, and to simultaneously build a full, complete life that doesn't depend on that reverence ever translating into presence or reconnection. These two things aren't contradictory. They're simply two separate truths, one about the past and about someone else's internal experience, and one about the present and about what actually deserves to be prioritised moving forward. There's a physiological dimension worth naming as well, because it helps explain why these particular memories resist the fading that governs most of an avoidance relational history, rather than this resistance being simply a matter of sentiment or exaggeration. Experiences that combine genuine emotional safety with high authenticity and presence tend to be encoded by the nervous system differently than ordinary experiences, processed and stored with a kind of vividness typically reserved for moments of real significance rather than routine, unremarkable interaction. This isn't unique to avoidance. It's a general feature of how human memory prioritizes what gets retained versus what gets allowed to blur and fade. What makes this particularly notable in an avoidance case is simply how rare this specific combination of safety and authenticity is for them, which means the number of memories encoded with this kind of durability tends to be extremely small, sometimes limited to a single relationship across an entire lifetime of otherwise unremarkable romantic history. This explains why, when this pattern does appear, it tends to appear so distinctly, standing out clearly against a much larger backdrop of forgotten or minimized relationships. It isn't simply that the avoidant chooses to remember this particular connection more vividly. Their nervous system does much of that work automatically, prioritizing and preserving this specific experience precisely because it was rare enough and significant enough to warrant that kind of lasting, durable encoding in the first place. There's something worth naming about what this understanding actually offers, distinct from any hope about the future, because its real value lies almost entirely in the past, rather than in any promise about what comes next. It offers accurate closure regarding a question that likely lingered for a long time: whether the connection was ever truly as significant as it felt while it was happening, or whether that significance was imagined, exaggerated by hope or longing into something that was never actually there. The pattern being described throughout this exploration, protective, reverent silence rather than ordinary indifference, offers a fairly clear, psychologically grounded answer to that question. The significance was real. It simply expressed itself through absence rather than presence, which made it almost impossible to recognize clearly, while the confusion of that absence was still actively being lived through. There's an important caution worth addressing directly at this point, because everything explored so far, however psychologically accurate, carries a real risk of being misused in a way that causes genuine harm. And that risk deserves direct, unambiguous attention rather than being left as an implied afterthought. Framing a connection as sacred and framing an avoidance silence as reverence rather than simple unavailability can become a dangerously seductive narrative for anyone inclined toward romanticizing difficulty, mistaking intensity and mystery for depth, and mistaking someone else's fear for evidence of extraordinary love.